Hey there, fellow foodies. This is Dr. Quave, and you're listening to Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious. You're tuning in to season 7 of the show, and we've got another fantastic guest for you today. I'm going to be speaking with Dr. Daniel Villar. He is a conservation biologist and ecologist who focuses on traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, which we're going to dive into a bit more in the show. And he works in the central Andes. He's interested in how TEK changes over time, what drives those changes, and what are the impacts of this traditional knowledge on the ecology of the regions where it shifts. For his doctoral research, he focused on the wetlands around Lake Titicaca, examining how changes in totora sedge harvest techniques influence the ecology of these wetlands, especially in relation to endemic fish and bird species, including the endemic Titicaca flightless grebe. He recently defended his doctoral thesis in biology at Oxford University in the UK. And in his doctoral or postdoctoral research, he's planning to apply cultural evolutionary methods to TEK change at 4 field sites. We met each other this summer, actually in Prague, in the Czech Republic, at the Society for Ethnobotany meeting. And after hearing his talk, I just knew I had to get him on the show. So thanks so much, Daniel, for coming on the show. And it's great to see you again.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to speak with you again.
Yeah. So I want to start by painting a picture of this field site. What can you tell us about where you did your doctoral research? Where can you find this special lake?
Yeah, so Lake Titicaca is found in the Central Andes, as you said, at 3,800 meters. It's shared between Peru and Bolivia, and it is absolutely gorgeous, as you can see in the photo there. It's in the middle of the lake. You cannot see the shore, but you can see in the distance the snow-capped peaks of the Central Andes. And it has been a center of cultivation and of human society for millennia. We have evidence from the Taraco field site, which has been an archaeological field site that's been there since the early 90s, directed by Christian Hastorf, of agriculture there longer than there's been agriculture in parts of Europe. So this is very much a
Wow.
cultural landscape. And as you say, lots of endemic species, including the flightless Titicaca grebe. Uh,
Sorry, I mispronounced it. Grebe, not greb.
oh, no, it's all right. I think ornithologist versus botanical training. Probably that. If I pronounce plant names, no doubt I'd cock it up tremendously.
That's great. So, um, so you're seeing these endemic species, and again, just for those that are new to this term endemic, it's basically a species of life that only occurs in this one part of the world. So this is a very special area, rich in biodiversity, and very special for its long history in agriculture. There's also something else that I've always found interesting about this, and this is the floating islands or floating houses. Tell us about that, because I just want to, again, paint this picture of what it's like to be someone that historically has lived in this area. What was life like for local inhabitants?
So when you refer to the floating islands, those are made of totora sedge. And the totora sedge, which there are some photos of it being burnt, is found in a lot of Lake Titicaca. It gets harvested, it gets dried, and the Uru ethnic group historically lived on these floating islands. And it's precisely, what you're imagining is broadly accurate to what it is. It's an island, a raft made of the sedge. Often it would contain multiple households. And historically, it was nomadic. It moved from place to place, but nowadays they're very much anchored. I should say that the Uru are not the only ethnic group that live in Lake Titicaca. And historically, actually, the Uru were amongst the smallest of the ethnic groups that live in Lake Titicaca. They're the most famous, just given of how distinctive their lifestyle is of living on these lakes. And when you read like Weston Labar or Alexander Forbes, these are 19th, 20th century anthropologists that worked in the region, they'll talk about meeting people who will say that they'd rarely, if ever, visited dry land. So that's very rare. But the vast majority of inhabitants of the area around Lake Titicaca are either Aymara speakers, which is the majority, and that is roughly from Puno Bay all the way around north until you reach the Peruvian-Bolivian border, or Quechua speakers, which is from Puno Bay north. Sorry, Aymara speakers south, Puno Bay north is Quechua speakers. And those are agriculturalists and historically potato, quinoa, other chenopods, other tubers, oca. Some livestock, guinea pigs, in the more modern period, sheep, some llama, donkeys, obviously, in the modern period as well. So most life in the region for most people wouldn't have been on these floating islands, as picturesque and as iconic as they are. Instead, for most people, they would have just been farmers.
Okay, so you've got farmers around the edge of the lake, and then you have it's hard for me to imagine what life is like on these floating islands. How large are these? You mentioned multiple households. Like, how many people might live on one of these floating islands made of this little sedge? I mean, are we talking 3 people, 10? Like, how many people could they hold?
Well, depends on the size of the raft, essentially. I mean, you would have, in some cases, 50, 60 people, but very often they would, if it thought it was getting a bit crowded, build a new raft. Or if there was a dispute between people, you'd split the rafts apart. One group goes one way, one group goes the other way. It should be said that this is very much something that used to happen. The floating islands nowadays are almost entirely, not all, but 99% of them found in Puno Bay, quite close to the city of Puno, which is the provincial capital, which is the second biggest city after Juliaca of the province, but it's the biggest one on the lake itself. Uh, and it's primarily for tourism. Obviously, the Uru people are very proud of their history, and I wouldn't say that they're not living it. But it is true that the majority of Uru, who historically were fishers, who were hunters, and so on, now live off tourism, and therefore it makes more sense to have the islands within an hour of the big city, accessible by tourists. And now, very often, these islands will have electricity, plumbing, and so on. And the main inhabitants will be the tourists that pay $50 or $100 a night to stay there, while
Wow.
a lot of the Uru themselves live in the neighborhood of Tuyuni in Puno, which is just on the far side of sort of a hill that. So Puno itself, the core of the city, is at the end of the bay with hills all around it, and the main Uru neighborhood is on the other side of those hills. And the
Okay.
majority of Uru today live on dry land. They send their kids to schools, and many of them just use the proceeds of tourism for that, which is perfectly appropriate. I would do the
Mhm.
same thing if I was in their
Yeah,
position.
yeah, of course. Well, this is fascinating. So this plant, this specific sedge, obviously has a very long and deep relevance for survival in the region. It seems like it's changed. Its role has changed as economies have changed. Um, I want to kind of think a bit more about how this also has changed with shifting dynamics in food systems. So you mentioned that they rely a lot on fishing. Were they able to cultivate vegetables on these islands, or how do you get something beyond fish if you're living on this floating raft?
Well, you hunt, and then
Ah,
you also get ducks, but no, veg is not something you'd get. So, one of the darker side, say, of the historical ethnography that you read in Lake Titicaca, in that region, is that one reason why the Uru would live on these islands is that they weren't really allowed to live anywhere else. It was very much when it came to the social stratification of society along ethnic lines, even before the Spanish conquest, the Uru were considered below the Aymara, who were themselves below the Quechua. The Aymara, of course, having been conquered by the Quechua-speaking Inca Empire only about 100 years before the Spanish arrived. And
wow.
hence why some Aymara actually sided with the Spanish to attack the Incas.
Mm.
And the Urus, so I think it's in Inca Garcilaso where he's talking about which ethnic groups give different tribute to the Inca emperor in Cusco. He discusses how the Uru just basically give frogs and fish and things of very little value. And this is despite the fact that, as far as we can tell from genetic evidence, the Uru have been living in the Altiplano region longer than any of the other extant ethnic groups in the region. So they've been there the longest, and they really got the short end of the stick.
Yeah. Well, this then ties in really well to traditions. How traditional is traditional ecological knowledge? How does that play into your research?
So yes, so to give some background for your listeners and to your viewers, I suppose, traditional ecological knowledge is this term that's often bandied about in the ethnobiology literature and the conservation social science literature, which focuses on this knowledge that indigenous people or local people might have of their environment. And you have a lot of theoretical debate about how does this differentiate from local ecological knowledge, just things that local people know, but is it different if they learned it versus if they were taught by their parents? How many generations does it need to be? And very often it can be difficult, if not impossible, to disentangle which is which, if only because, especially a pre-literate society, you're relying on oral tradition. And I don't want to denigrate oral tradition, but from literate societies where we can directly compare oral and non-oral tradition, we know that oral tradition has a lot lower fidelity of information than written information. So the lack of the written record really makes it almost impossible to know how old some of these uh, forms of knowledge are. We can try to do phylogenetic ancestral reconstruction for some of them, but even then that comes with its own caveats. So how traditional does it have to be traditional ecological knowledge? Probably depends on who you ask and for what purpose it is. To a large degree, as a conservationist, what I'm particularly interested in is this idea of knowledge that helps with sustainability, because it's knowledge that developed through a process of almost coevolution with the landscape. That's often the justification for using traditional ecological knowledge in conservation programs. And we do know of some examples where that seems to have been the case, burning practices in Australia from Aboriginal people, for instance. But it cannot just be assumed to be the case, and that is the mechanism of the environmental knowledge that we are seeing in contemporary indigenous communities.
Well, that's really that really is an interesting take. It gets into that nuance of the movement of information. Um, when you mentioned something around the role of ethnobiology, and I'm curious, like, what are your thoughts on the importance of ethnobiology in conservation? Because a lot of ethnobiology is really focused not on necessarily on action, but on observation, um, documentation of traditional practices. Whereas conservation is a bit more of an active implementation of processes to ensure that we have continuity in species. So, how do these two fields come together, conservation biology and ethnobiology?
Well, you're absolutely right about conservation biology. Soule, in one of the early essays, trying to explain what it is in the 80s, because we need to remember it's actually a newer field than ethnobiology, arguably conservation biology. He has this wonderful essay called "What is Conservation Biology," where he says, well, if it's just describing how ecosystems deteriorate, well, that's just plain old ecology, and that's fine. But at the end of the day, if you want to call it conservation, you need to show how this leads to actual practice. And unfortunately, over time, that's been somewhat muddled, primarily simply because academics don't necessarily control policy. Uh, Now, ethnobiology, I think, can contribute to conservation in two main ways. One is understanding of ecological processes, because for the vast majority of ecosystems in the world, we don't really understand them very well. We don't know what species necessarily are there. We don't necessarily know what leads to what, and so on. And that's especially the case in the tropics, which are poorly studied compared to temperate regions, and yet have oodles and oodles of biodiversity. We understand the woodlands of the eastern United States fairly well, not saying that people shouldn't study it some more. We understand British ecology very well. Again, not to denigrate my colleagues who focus on studying British ecosystems. There's always something new to learn. But compared to what we know about Andean, Amazonian, Congo, Indo-Chinese ecosystems, it really is nothing. And the local knowledge that local people might have can help fill it in those gaps. So that can either be about what species are where, maybe it can be about which processes that they know lead to the declines of certain species, especially if it's ones that are relevant to them. If they hunt it, they know that when it doesn't rain much, this species isn't as common, but this one doesn't seem to be affected, and so on. It also allows us to get local buy-in. Conservation biology is actively trying to move beyond and really to consign to the dustbin of history the fortress conservation model that says essentially that Western scientists and NGOs arrive in these developing countries, they throw a lot of money at the problem and then exclude local people. Now, obviously, there are times when you need a degree of a protected area where you just have to exclude certain uses. You kind of have to prevent poachers, and that can get very ugly. But you need to have local buy-in at a certain point, because without it, it makes it incredibly expensive and unsustainable in the long term. A good example of this was in Iran. before the Iranian Revolution of 1979, there was actually a lot of active Western conservation NGO work, a lot of it associated with people with the Shah's regime. It was sort of, some of them had been to the West, became sort of bourgeois environmentalists, and a bit of reputation laundering. With the revolution, there was resentment in some rural communities, especially against some of the large predators, such as the cheetah, which does exist in Iran, or used to. Now the Asiatic cheetahs, I think, only found in Gujarat, in India. Uh, uh, and, when the Shah's soldiers and park rangers were no longer there to enforce it, a way to take out your anger at the fellas who've been oppressing you for decades is to go after the things that they cared about, which is this wildlife. So
Yeah.
ethnobiology, I think, can do a culturally informed conservation program where we get that local buy-in of local indigenous peoples.
No, I 100% agree. I think when we think about conservation from the lens of only the landscape or the, plant, animal, fish species, that are there, and we leave the human story out of that, all of those initiatives ultimately seem to fail if you look at the track record. It's like, so having that culture aspect or the ethno part of ethnobiology engaged in conservation is so important. Um, what can you tell us about where you see ethnobiology contributing to this kind of preservation of not just biodiversity, but also cultural heritage? I mean, is there a path forward where we're able to really conserve biocultural diversity? Um, and why might that be a more sustainable model or a more effective model?
So can we consider? Yeah, ideally, yes, we would obviously want to consider cultural diversity and biological diversity, and there's an interplay between the two of them. I suspect, similar to in conservation biology, you have a triage, and unfortunately, you do accept that in some cases you do lose biodiversity. You don't win every battle. Sometimes you have to focus on species A rather than species B, or landscape A or landscape B. I suspect it'll be the same with trying to preserve cultural diversity. Not every battle will be won, and there will be some cultural loss. I mean, that's simply the nature of an increasingly globalized world. New cultural synergies might also come about, but on the whole, we will lose some culture. I do think that we can try to conserve local culture and conserve biodiversity in cases where local cultural practices really help with local biodiversity. So in those cases, perhaps showing that the way to conserve the biodiversity is through the cultural practices, and
Yeah.
working with those who are interested in the cultural practices in the local communities will create a sort of synergy. But it'll be very condition dependent. It'll be very local dependent. So unfortunately, I'm not sure if there's sort of a broad base,
Uh,
one size
yeah.
fits all solution.
I'm thinking of like examples. They're so visually evident when you think of, well, in Ethiopia where you have these sacred forests, these kind of, or there's a sacredness to certain areas of nature. And they're almost, I mean, it's very stark. They're like islands in the midst of just completely decimated landscapes that have just been clear cut for agriculture and other purposes. But then, where there's a cultural relevance to certain sites, those holy sites are just incredible refuges for biodiversity. I think it varies. Like what is sacred from one culture to another is obviously very different. But yeah, there are a lot of examples like that, or baobabs. There are certain trees that are kind of protected over time by
Oh, in the
different
Central Andes, where certain mountains are considered sacred, that they have spirits, the Apu, in
yeah,
them. And that has motivated a lot of opposition to mining, especially when it comes to, clear cut, cutting the top of the mountain off mining, which is the most common nowadays because it's cheaper.
yeah,
And a lot of the anti-mining activism comes from this indigenous spiritual source.
great. I think it's very different from like Western perceptions of nature. I find that there's often this sense of dominion over the natural world, or this need to tame or control the natural world, and a lack of recognition of our role within the natural world that can really put nature at risk if that makes sense. I don't know. It's interesting.
Yes, no, I mean that's obviously one element to it. And in the Andes, you have obviously a Andean cosmovision, which has been written about to death. And I'm not a cultural anthropologist, so
Yeah.
apologies for stepping on anyone's toes here. But you have, the Pachamama, this idea that the earth itself is sacred, that you
Mhm.
owe things to it, and often that manifests in relatively small ways. Like before having a drink, you often pour a bit to the ground to show that
Yes.
giving the earth her share, so to speak. But
Well,
also it can manifest in larger ways, such as the government of Evo Morales, which was very much an indigenous-led government, doing some legislation for environmental protection. But it has to be said that same government also did things like do the Tipanis roadway through the Amazon, which led to higher rates of deforestation. So
mm,
it's obviously indigenous people, indigenous knowledge is very important for biocultural conservation and it shouldn't be ignored. But I think it's not a simple one to one. And also, we shouldn't ignore the fact that within indigenous communities, you'll get significant variation when it comes to attitudes towards biodiversity. And that's actually one of the findings of one of the chapters of my thesis was precisely on that, on the fact that there isn't really one Aymara, one Quechua, one Uru environmental ethos, that you have
mm,
as much variety in that as you would say in American society, where you had people like Chenoweth Higi, if you remember who she was, the Republican from Idaho in the 90s, who hated the Endangered Species Act and used to throw barbecues of endangered species.
oh,
Uh, she was a congresswoman. And you also have people who are in charge of the biggest environmental NGOs in the world within the
yeah.
same cultural sphere. So I would be worried about simplifying and saying this is the indigenous worldview when that's you're talking about thousands of cultures, really.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Well, I want to dig in deeper into your research and let's go back maybe to that special sedge that was used to build these rafts that people historically lived on. Um, what other uses has this plant had in the past and how is it used today?
Well, in the past, one use, given that this is a foodie podcast, and I
Mhm.
apologize, I've not spoken much about food, is that you can eat it. You can eat the
Ah,
roots. It's
very
called
nice.
queso de totora. It's soft, white, slightly sweet, quite nice. Not recommended that you eat it in the more polluted areas of the lake, if only because we know that totora soaks up methyl mercury like nothing else.
Ah,
It's a
this
bit like
bioremediation. Nice.
oh god, it's a sponge for it, really is. So don't eat it in the polluted areas. But it was a very common food stuff for the Uru. Um, historically as
These
well used
are
for
living are these islands, like, alive? These rafts, are
the
they living plants or they're dried and, like, just
the they're
they're floating?
dried. The other thing that they're used for is artisanal goods made out of the dried sedge, and I can show you that so you
Oh,
can see what the dried sedge looks like.
yeah.
Is this.
Okay,
So
it looks like a little boat with it's a very thin, looks almost like a grass that's woven together. Beautiful.
yeah, so this is so you get the main sedge is not the rope there, but that there that you might see.
Okay.
Here you another one, artistic
Another little
rendition.
boat. Cute.
Yes.
With a
And
llama
this,
on
to be
top.
honest, is one of their main uses nowadays. That they are used for these things that you sell to tourists or
Ah,
artisanals do.
okay.
Local people buy them as well to decorate their house. You very often when you visit someone's house, they'll have a couple of these goods as decoration. I think they're quite pretty, actually,
Oh,
quite nice.
they're lovely. Yeah.
You can see the sort of the bright colors. The rainbow is a symbol you see everywhere in the Central Andes. It was the Huipala flag, which was the banner of the Inca emperor, was a rainbow. So if you go,
Wow.
for instance, to the province of Cusco, their main flag, which they've had since the colonial period as sort of the provincial flag, looks remarkably like the pride flag.
Wow. That's wild. So so when they're eating the roots of this plant, can they just be consumed raw, or do you need to cook them in some way?
Well, just raw.
Just raw. Okay, so is it more like a snack, or would it be like a part of a meal?
Mainly a snack. If you're out fishing all day or you're out cutting totora all day, you can, if you're a bit hungry, pull it out, have a bite. It should say it's only really the tubers and a bit above that is edible. Beyond that, it gets a bit too leafy.
Okay. Nice. Cool. So it's used now for these handicrafts and as a food, and of course in the past with
Right. And food for cattle.
and food for cattle. Yeah. So tell me, I recall from your lecture in Prague that you spoke about this about changing dynamics. So how is this also integrated into modern agriculture in the area?
So yes, so historically, uh, each of these communities. So totora, it should be said, is very much a plant whose distribution is mediated by humans. We have no evidence of it in Lake Titicaca before humans arrived, and it's not naturally found in the Andes. It's naturally found on the Pacific coast. So it was brought by humans deliberately. And historically, it seems that the management of this plant was done on a collective basis, what's called the ayu. The ayu is each village council would essentially have this collective, which would agree who controls which plot of land for grazing their sheep or their llama or their alpaca. You know, they'd control justice. They'd control basically every aspect of life. It's so important that many Andean anthropologists will talk about the ayu as being the basic building block of Andean society. And it has been that case for at least 500, if not more, years. Obviously, before 500 years ago, we don't really have written records. So
There's
we there's the Kipu, but no one has figured out how to decipher that yet, if you know
okay.
what those are. The
What are the kipu? Can you explain?
the Kipu are sort of strings with knots on them, which, according to early Inca sources that wrote in Spanish after the conquest, were ways of conveying information. But
Oh,
unfortunately, they never told us how they did so. So we actually don't know what they say or how to decipher them.
wow. That's like the ultimate puzzle.
Yes, I mean, there's much smarter people than I working on that. I mean, I think it's been an active source of investigation for a couple of centuries.
Incredible.
Touch wood, we figured it out. But yeah, so the IU historically was incredibly important, and it still is to a certain degree. It's more important in Bolivia than in Peru at the moment, I'd argue. Um, in the Spanish conquest, oddly enough, the IU, despite being this sort of indigenous self governance, was very much integrated into the Spanish governance structure. And that's, well, so first of all, the Spanish period was several centuries, so you have variation in it. But after you have the Toledan reforms of Archbishop Toledo, who that's in the late 16th century. And part of that is the movement of Andean rural communities to more concentrated villages. Uh, and the modern IUs tend to descend from those villages. And also the reintroduction of the mita system, which had existed in the Inca Empire, where there was corvée labor. But for our purposes, we'll focus on the IU. The IU then was attempted to be suppressed after the Bourbon reforms, which was in the 18th century after the War of Spanish Succession, when the Bourbons took over Spain and they tried to modernize what they viewed to be this very inefficient Habsburg way of doing things. Because the Habsburg way of doing things is basically, so long as they're Catholic and they give us gold, we don't care how they manage their internal affairs.
Ah,
And the Spanish, for instance, permitted Inca noblemen who converted to Catholicism to keep their lands and their peasantry. And you have Inca noblemen who become Spanish noblemen, that their
wow.
titles are recognized by Spain. Um, and the Bourbon reforms in the late 18th century was an attempt to do away with that and say, we'll give land to individual plot owners and we'll break this communal structure, sort of early liberal ideas, not in the American sense, but in the classical liberal sense. Uh, you know, uh, think sort of the early economists like Adam Smith. And that led to several rebellions. The most famous of which is the Tupac Amaru rebellion, where the city of Puno was burned down, where the Spanish were actually basically expelled from the Altiplano for 3 years.
Wow.
You also had the Tupac Katari rebellion, which was further south in the Altiplano. Uh, with the Spanish, when the Spanish were kicked out in the Wars of Independence, the new governments also tried to suppress the IU because the revolutionaries tended to be liberal and they viewed the IU as this medieval holdover. Uh,
Mm.
I mean, to the point that the last royalist army in the New World was almost entirely indigenous, made of Andean indigenous people who were fighting against Simon Bolivar at the Battle of Ayacucho, which is not that far from Lake Titicaca. It's in the central Andean region. And it's only in the 20th century that the IU gains legal recognition. So it survives multiple attempts to abolish it. And this entire time, it stays as the foundational unit of how Andean society is structured. And Weston Labar agrees with that. Ben Orlov, who's still alive, so I don't want to misquote him, but he did a lot of work in the 80s and 70s and 90s on Lake Titicaca ethnography and the IU itself as well. They all agree that the IU is how Andean societies agree on how natural resources are used. And
Wow.
that's very much not the case in a lot of the Central Andes today.
Okay.
Nowadays, you have individual plots. That thing that the liberal reformers tried to impose 200 years ago and failed has now been almost self-imposed. In the majority of Lake Titicaca, when you go there, whoever owns the land by the shore owns the totora there, and they will have then the right to sell that totora to their neighbors. And you have people who that is their specialized profession, that they cut totora, they dry it, they sell it to people who live further up the mountain in better grazing territory as an overwintering food for sheep, for cattle, primarily sheep, some llama as well. Not really alpaca. Alpaca is found in the region, but just very expensive. So your average peasant won't be able to afford to buy one.
Mm,
It's
yeah.
just too expensive. It's
How are they packing up this dried totora? Is it rolled like one would do like
uh,
typical hay, or is it kind of packed in squares? Like how do they prepare it for transportation up
in
into high
bundles,
areas?
like with hay.
Okay. Could be able to pay. Interesting.
Not quite as big as the bales of hay you'll see in the US. They don't have the great machines for it.
Yeah,
This
yeah,
is
of
all
course.
done by hand still.
Yeah. That's incredible. So this remains like I'm just thinking of, as you recount this history, I'm thinking of all of the different stories that the totora, the species, has been involved in over centuries of people that have lived in this area, and invaders that have come and left, and all of the cultural melting pot that's kind of been mixed in this area. Yeah.
Yes, no, I mean, the Totora is a lens through which to look at Andean history, or at least like
Mhm.
Titicaca history.
Yeah. Incredible. Well, Daniel, tell me, as we're running low on time, but I do want to get to one last question, just to find out a bit more about your future work, and how you're going to take lessons that you've gleaned from your work with the Torah to other field sites, and kind of what's your future vision for your work in ethnobiology.
So I should say I'm applying for funds to go back to Lake Titicaca, to go back to the Central Andes, because I absolutely adore the Andes. I know my
Yeah.
accent doesn't betray it, but I was born in the Andes. My father's family is from Bogota, in the Colombian Andes, so
Hmm.
it's very much a region near and dear to my heart. So I absolutely adore it.
You speak fluent Spanish, I'm guessing, as well, though your accent.
Obviously, my Mara and my Ketra isn't great. I sort of forget by, Inglaterra Mantacani, that type of phrase. It means I'm English, but which I'm not. But it's. I realized trying to explain the different parts of the UK was a lost cause, so there's no
Yeah,
point.
yeah. It's
Uh,
so
but it's so. But other than that, I'm currently a postdoc at the Department of Anthropology in Durham University, working with Jamie Tarani on cultural evolution of traditional ecological knowledge under different climate scenarios. So I'm doing more of the modeling, the data analysis, the very quantitative
Mm.
mathematical bits, which I think are fun. But I admit that for some of your listeners, they might, when I mention things like network theory and phylogenetic covariance matrices and all that, it might sound
Music
a bit
my
fun.
ears, I mean.
I think it's fun. But yeah, so there we're working on 4 field sites.
Okay.
One is Hoona, Alaska, where we're working with the Hoona Indian Association.
Okay.
One is in southern Mexico, in Chiapas, where we're working with the Maya community there. One is in Mongolia, and one is in Kazakhstan. And we're
Wow.
collecting data on what natural resources are used and how people learn about them and what they're used for, to create these sort of complete networks of who learned from who within the community. So very much a snowball sampling technique,
Oh,
rather
fantastic to see
than
how knowledge
random.
transfers across generations or within generations.
Well, both. So what we're
Mhm.
interested to see is, first of all, how do different types, are there general rules of different types of knowledge, different types of use are learnt in different ways?
Mm.
And then we're going to try to model how resource availability influences how resources are learnt. So if this is a resource that is relatively stable year to year, you'd expect it to be vertically transmitted. If it's one that is more patchy or perhaps is less common, you might expect it to be more horizontally learnt potentially. But that's just a theoretical model right now. We want to prove it empirically. And then looking forwards with climate change, we know that the distribution of these resources will change depending, well, on various factors. And then modeling how will it change and which types of ecological knowledge are likely to be more resilient to environmental change than others.
That's great.
And that's the project I'm working on now.
So, I mean, I think also just to put this in the framework for our listeners, ethnobotany has been described as the science of survival. And this traditional knowledge you're speaking of pertains to wild foods, to materials for housing, to materials used for art, for cultural events. It's all those things that make us human. It allows us to survive in different climates. And I think we're all observing some shifts in the weather and some shifts in overall patterns in climate. And so understanding resiliency and how knowledge factors into this is such an important area of research. So I'm glad that you're going to be doing this. That's really great.
Yes, no, imagine you have it worse in Georgia than us in the UK. I mean, I felt hot enough at 30 degrees. I don't even want to know what it was in Georgia.
The secret though is we have air conditioning. So it's like it kind of, you don't suffer as much. I was in Greece this summer during the European heat wave. And I mean, it was intense. It was very intense heat. Yeah.
Yes, no, the American South, it's like a lunar colony or something that you go from the one climate controlled space
Yes.
to the
Yeah, that's
other,
the heat and
and the
back.
outside is hostile. This is why, even though I love the tropics, I work in the high mountains. At
Yeah.
3,800 meters, it's 10 degrees year round. It's brilliant.
Wow. Constant temperature. There you go. Very cool. Fantastic. Well, thanks so much, Tino, for coming to the show. I really enjoyed speaking with you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for having me. And I hope you have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you. All right. You've been listening to Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious. You can find us anywhere you like to listen to your podcast. You can also catch the video version of this episode on our YouTube channel at Teach Ethnobotany. Thanks so much for listening. Stay healthy out there, and we'll see you next time. Oh, I forgot, Rob, to say buy us a coffee.
That's okay.
Can I redo that? Let me just redo the end clip.
Sure.
Yeah. All right, that's it for today. Thanks so much for listening to the show. You can find us on any of your favorite podcasting streams. You can also find us at YouTube at the Teach Ethnobiology channel. And if you'd like to help our show, you can do something really, really awesome. Buy me a coffee. Producer Rob and Christine and I would love to have some additional coffee in our days. And through this portal, you can help to financially support the show so we can keep bringing you great guests every week. Thanks so much for listening. Stay healthy out there, and I'll see you next time.